This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Itzahon, and today is Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, this series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. I like to look at the best cards in an individual set from time to time, and today we're doing everyone's favorite, Fallen Empires. In all seriousness, Fallen Empires is considered by some to be the worst set ever printed. Personally, I think the worst set is actually Homelands, and I did a top 10 on that set a few months back. I think once we're done with this video, and then you go and compare it to the Homelands video, you'll see I'm right. But really, we're just splitting hairs here. Fallen Empires and Homelands are two of the worst sets ever when it comes to how many cards from the set have made an impact on competitive Magic. Sometimes, though, it is fun to look at one of these much maligned sets and pick out the cards that have actually made a lasting impact. In all, Fallen Empires had 187 cards. Of those, 19 have seen play, which is good enough for 10%. That might not sound good, but already we're seeing a better rate than we saw with Homelands. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A top 8 at a Pro Tour, Players Tour, Mythic Invitational, Legacy Championship, or Vintage Championship is worth 2 points, and a Grand Prix or Magic Fest top 8 is worth 1 point. Alright, let's get into the list and look at some good cards in this terrible set. At number 10, it is Orcs Spy. There are actually several cards from the set with exactly 2 points, but I gave Orcs Spy the number 10 slot because the most copies of it were played in the main deck. The other cards with 2 points were Acacian Town and Dwarven Catapult. But anyway, back to Orcs Spy. This little 1-mana 1/1 is an activated ability that gives you some information about your opponent's deck. This is not really a card that would be anywhere near getting close to play today, as this type of information isn't really worth running a 1-mana 1/1 for. However, it was in a deck that top-8'd the 1995 World Championship. This deck was a mono-red deck that ran a bunch of burn and cheap creatures, as well as ways to disrupt the opponent's plans with land destruction. The Orcs Spy could be kind of useful in scenarios where you're trying to decide whether you want to nuke a land. It could allow you to see if your opponent is going to draw a land, and that helps you know whether it's worth blowing one up. At number 9, it is Goblin Grenade, one of the more iconic Fallen Empire cards, and it's actually one that I thought would be pretty high up in this list, but number 9 isn't that impressive. The Grenade is a pretty sweet Goblin payoff. It gives you a 1-mana way to do 5 damage to something, and Goblins are always pretty expendable. It didn't actually see any play by virtue of its original printing. Goblin decks weren't really a thing at the time, but after being reprinted in M12, it put up some points in both standard and modern Goblin decks. At number 8, it is Yola Pyle, which is a real thing, believe it or not, or at least based on one. In our reality, it's an ancient steam turbine. I'm not really sure why this one does damage. I guess the idea maybe is that it's blowing up, but whatever. We see artifacts that can sack to do damage to stuff pretty often, and this one is not the most impressive to us today. However, it was a colorless way to do damage to stuff, and that had its uses. It appeared in 2 of the top 8 decks at Pro Tour New York in 1996. Neither of these decks were red, so it isn't like they had access to direct damage spells. This gave decks some reach and a way to kill some smaller creatures. Unsurprisingly, though, it hasn't found any success since 1996. At number 7, it is Orig. These days, we might look at a 5-mana 6/6 with trample and no downside as kind of a meh card for constructed, but when Orig was printed, that wasn't the case. It had impressive stats and evasion to go along with it, so it had to have quite the hefty downside to compensate for that. If your opponent has big enough creatures, you can't block them, and you can't attack them. However, if your deck has lots of nice removal, not to mention Icy Manipulator, the Orig's downside doesn't come up so much, and instead it just smashes face really efficiently, and that's exactly what Orig did in Standard between 1995 and 1996. Obviously, creature power creep has kept it from ever seeing play again, but it was quite the impressive creature back in the mid-90s. At number 6, it is Acacian Javelineers. This simple little card has quite the elegant design, as it's a 1-mana 1/1 that can only ping something once since, it throws its javelin to do that damage. Most pingers cost a lot more than 1 mana, even these days, so the fact it can do that so cheaply is nice, even if it can only do it once. Interestingly, the Javelineers didn't see any play from their original printing in Fallen Empires. It was likely overlooked. But once it was printed as a time-shifted card about 10 years later in Time Spiral, It found success for the first time as it was played in both standard and extended Boros aggro decks. At number 5, it is High Tide. While this only occupies the number 5 spot on this list, High Tide is well known as one of the most powerful ramp spells in the history of the game, and it's the kind of card that really makes it hard to think of Fallen Empires as the weakest set ever. Doubling the mana your islands produce for a turn for only 1 mana is crazy. It found success in eponymous mono-blue control decks and extended that sought to win the game with High Tide and Stroke of Genius, making their opponent draw their whole library. It also gained points in legacy decks that further combined High Tide with Candelabra of Tawnos to produce even more mana, and then win the game in a similar fashion with Blue Sun Zenith. While High Tide has stopped seeing play in Legacy, it is worth noting it's a key card in many EDH decks and one of the best mana ramp cards in Cube, so even if it has stopped putting up points, it continues to be a pretty iconic card from this set that people see on a regular basis. At number 4, it is Order of Light Bur. This would be a pretty nice creature even by today's standards. Protection from a color is always nice and means that it can really rip apart black decks, but even if you take protection out of the equation, the Order has activated abilities that combine to make it quite difficult to block and make it a nice aggressive creature. It was played in white aggro decks in both standard and extended from 1996 to 1997. And at number 3, I've actually included a whole cycle. These are all lands that enter the battlefield tapped and can tap for 1 mana. For Ruins of Trocaire, for example, that mana is white, but these lands can also sacrifice to add 2 mana to your mana pool of the same color. If I gave each of these their own slot on this list, Ruins of Trocaire would be the legit number 3. Meanwhile, the Battleground would have been number 5, the Ruins number 6, the Temple number 7, and the Stronghold would be tied for 10th, so you can see why I decided to give them all the same slot. These lands offer some very real ramp, and sure, you may hurt your long-term prospects by giving up a land in some decks, but these were primarily played in aggro decks, who could use the mana to move up to a higher spot on their curve, with the plan being that you would then kill your opponent before the downside of giving up that land would matter. The points for all of these came only in standard in the mid-90s, with the one exception being Havenwood Battleground, which gained a couple of points in extended Allurin decks in the mid-2000s. At number 2, it is Order of the Ebon Hand, which is the mirror image of Order of Light Bur. Obviously, it costs double black instead of double white, and has protection from white instead of black, and has activated abilities that cost black mana instead of white mana. But yeah, these two were designed to be mirror images of each other, something we've seen with a lot of white and black 2-drops over the years. It's kind of a recurring theme we see on a regular basis. The Order of the Ebon Hand has found more success than the Order of Light Bur, though. As you would expect, Order of the Ebon Hand was largely played in black aggro decks in Standard. It was also played in extended Necropotence decks. It also experienced a brief renaissance in 2007 when it managed to put up 2 Grand Prix top 8s at the Legacy Grand Prix Columbus in 2007, and both of the decks it appeared in were, of course, black aggro decks. It doesn't have any points since 2007, but that's okay. Its number 2 spot on this list is safe because none of the cards we've talked about so far are played today. And the number 1 card on this list has a huge lead, so even if the Order of the Ebon Hand miraculously started being played again, it's probably never going to catch the number 1 card on this list, which is Hymn to Turok, which is one of the game's most powerful and iconic discard spells. The Hymn will always grant you a 2-for-1, and because the discard is random, it can really punish your opponent. It frequently causes significant disruption if you can cast it early, sometimes making your opponent miss land drops or discard something that they wanted to play on curve or lose some powerful spell. It was played in various black decks while in Standard and was basically a staple between 1995 and 1996. Some of these decks even utilized the rack to get some extra damage out of discard effects. It was a little too powerful in Standard, with many games determined by who managed to cast a Hymn first, and as a result it was restricted in Standard in 1996. It also saw some significant play in extended Necropotence decks between 1997 and 1998. For the last 15 years or so, the Hymn has been played regularly in Legacy 2 since it is so effective at disrupting opposing game plans. For a long time, it was mostly played in more aggressive decks there, as you generally want to cast this early and hope the extra time that it buys you lets you do lethal to your opponent before they can get a defense together. These days, it is actually played in very different decks, like Grixis Control and Dark Depths. Either way, the Hymn will continue to amass points in Legacy. It has the most points of any Fallen Empires card by far and continues to put up points. I think it will always hold this spot on this list. Well, those are the top 10 cards from one of the worst sets ever, Fallen Empires. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on the over 300 MTG top 10s I've already done, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.